While detectives were digging up her backyard, she was sitting in a bar, flirting with a stranger. 7 bodies in the ground, 7 graves hidden under flower beds in the middle of Sacramento. Squad cars lined the street, camera crews were set up on the sidewalk, and neighbors stood at the fence, unable to process what they were looking at. The whole country was glued to their televisions waiting for the next update. And she ordered a drink, gave a fake name, and asked the man across from her what he did for a living. Not because she was reckless, not because she panicked and lost her nerve, but because her entire life, that's exactly what she did. She sat down across from a stranger, smiled the right smile, and became whatever that person needed her to be. It was her greatest gift, her only real one. But it never failed her. Her name was Dorothea Puente. In Sacramento, people knew her as a kind-hearted older woman who opened her home to the people society had given up on. The sick, the lonely, the forgotten. People with nowhere to go and no one left to call. She made them breakfast every morning, managed their medications, and sat with them when no one else would. And she really did all of that. She just also buried them in her yard and cashed their pension checks for years. And not one person, not the neighbors, not the social workers, not the police, ever stopped to ask why the tenants at that boarding house disappeared with such quiet, almost clockwork regularity. Because she looked like somebody's grandmother. And that is the whole horror of this story. The house sat in the old part of Sacramento, on a block where tall trees arch over the road, and the afternoon light comes through the leaves in pieces. Wooden homes from the early part of the century, weathered, but maintaining a kind of dignity that newer construction never quite manages. The streets were quiet, in the way that working neighborhoods are quiet on weekday afternoons, not empty, just settled. Children coming home from school, lawn mowers somewhere, the distant sound of a television through an open window. Sacramento in the 1980s was a city in transition. Neither the agricultural capital it had been, nor quite the government town it was becoming, still figuring out what it wanted to be when it grew up. The neighborhoods around the capital were changing. Old boarding houses and rental rooms were filling up with the overflow of the city's social services, people who needed somewhere affordable, somewhere that would take them, somewhere that asked few questions. On F Street, in that old part of town, sat the house. A 2-story Victorian, pale yellow, black iron fence out front with Christmas lights still strung along it even in November, which made the place look festive in a way that felt slightly out of season but also somehow appropriate. Like a person who laughs too readily. You couldn't quite place what was off about it. Lace curtains in the windows, neat flower beds lining the front walk. A garden bench by the door where, on good days, Puente would sit and watch the street. The house looked exactly the way a good home is supposed to look. Inside, china dolls arranged on shelves throughout the common areas, lace doilies on every horizontal surface, a small television in the sitting room kept on at a low volume through most of the day, the smell of lavender throughout the house, and something warm and domestic from the kitchen, coffee usually, or whatever she was making for the tenants' breakfast. And Puente herself, short, heavy-set, in a house dress and big horn-rimmed glasses. At the door when new tenants arrived, a plate of food already ready, the words she said to everyone the same, "Welcome home." Sacramento's social workers loved her. They sent her the people everyone else had turned away. Chronic alcoholics that no other boarding house in the city would take on a second application. People with schizophrenia or other severe mental illness who needed medication management and constant gentle supervision. Elderly men who had ended up on the streets through some combination of circumstance and bad luck and who had no family left to call. The ones the system officially designated difficult cases and which it unofficially just wanted removed from the active file. Puente took them all, always had a room, always had a plate of food, never seemed bothered by the difficulty of any case. Parole officers who came by for check-ins left with good reports. Social workers who visited their clients at the house wrote notes about the clean conditions, the regular meals, the evident care. One social worker would later testify at trial, and his voice carried the tone of a man who was still, years later, having difficulty reconciling what he knew with what he had seen. She provided the best care I had ever seen in the system. He had no idea what was buried under those flower beds. Nobody did. But to understand how any of this was possible, you have to go back 60 years, to a small, dusty California town at the foot of the San Bernardino Mountains, to January of 1929, to a wooden house that was never quiet, but not for any good reason. Redlands, California, cotton fields stretching out to the horizon in every direction. In summer, the air smells like hot earth and highway dust, and the inside of a car that's been sitting in the sun too long. In winter, it smells like nothing, just cold. It was the kind of town where people knew your business before you knew it yourself, where Sunday church attendance was noted and remembered, and where a family with 7 children and a drinking problem was the kind of thing people talked about quietly and then let alone. That's where Dorothea Helen Gray was born, the 6th of 7 children. Her father, Jesse, picked cotton for wages that didn't stretch. Her mother, Trudy, drank. Both of them did, but Trudy did it with more commitment. The house she grew up in wasn't violent in the way people usually mean. There wasn't screaming every night, things getting thrown across the room. The cruelty there was a different kind. Quiet, suffocating. The kind that doesn't leave bruises. Just emptiness. And a child who learns very early that the adults around her are not reliable sources of safety. When her mother went on a bender, she locked the kids in a closet. Sometimes for hours, sometimes for a full day. When she came back, barely able to stand, reeking of whatever cheap stuff she'd been drinking, little Dorothea cleaned up after her, mopped the floor, changed her clothes, made sure the younger children had something to eat. Did it without a word, because that was just how things were, and because someone had to. Her father, on the bad nights, would pick up his rifle and say he was done living. One night he nearly meant it. When Dorothea was 8 years old, he died of tuberculosis. Quietly, in bed, coughing up blood over the course of several weeks during which nobody in the family talked about what was happening. When she was 9, her mother was killed in a motorcycle accident. Fast, no warning. There one day, gone the next, and that was the end of whatever family the Gray children had thought they had. 7 kids, all of a sudden, with nowhere to go and no one making decisions for them. They got split up between relatives and orphanages like furniture from an abandoned house, whoever would take what. An aunt here, a cousin there, a church-affiliated institution in another county. Dorothea ended up in an orphanage. Which one exactly, and what it was like, she never said. Not in any interview, not in any court proceeding, not in 40 years of talking to journalists and publishers and prison visitors who all wanted to know the same thing. What happened to her there, she almost never spoke about directly. Years later, in the materials from her murder trial, defense psychologists described those years in 2 words: systematic abuse. The court listened, nodded, called the next witness. The world moved on. But here's what you need to understand. Dorothea Gray didn't just survive that childhood, she erased it. As an adult, once she had her own house, her own reputation, her own tenants, she told everyone around her that she'd grown up in a big, loud, loving Mexican family. 18 brothers and sisters, parents who hugged her before bed. Poor, yes, but the warm kind of poor. The kind people come out of smiling, with stories about homemade tamales and a grandmother who sang. She talked about this invented childhood in such detail, Names, smells, little funny stories about siblings and neighborhood kids and summer evenings. That people believed her. Neighbors believed her. Journalists believed her. Social workers believed her. People who had known her for years believed her without question, because she told the story the same way every time, and there was nothing in her manner that suggested she was doing anything other than remembering. Not one word of it was true. She wasn't just lying about the past, she was building a completely different person. From nothing. The way you'd build a house on land that had been burned flat. A woman without trauma. A woman you could trust. A woman with a story. Warm, relatable, human. And people would love that woman. People would trust her. People would bring her their most vulnerable clients and say, "Take care of them." But that was still a long way off. For now she was 16 years old, freshly out of the orphanage, alone on the streets of Olympia, Washington. Young, fair-haired, blue eyes and a smile she'd already learned to switch on when she needed it. A few months later, they were married. The next 20 years of Dorothea Puente's life were about one thing. Not happiness, not love, not even money exactly. Just looking normal. Having what everybody else seemed to have without even trying. A house, a husband, neighbors who nodded at you on the way to the mailbox. That ordinary, unremarkable, dependable life that she had never once been given and could never stop chasing. The kind of life where nobody locks you in a closet, where nobody picks up a rifle, where there are enough people around who know your name that disappearing isn't the default. She had 2 daughters along the way, gave them both up, one to relatives, one for adoption. Didn't lose sleep over it. Children were part of the image she was constructing, not part of the life she actually wanted. The marriages came and went, 4 of them over roughly 20 years. All a mess in different ways. The first husband, the soldier, didn't last long after the war's novelty wore off. The second marriage produced more stability on paper, but constant conflict underneath. He eventually had her committed to a psychiatric ward. This was after police picked her up during a raid on a brothel she'd been running, an episode that also resulted in criminal charges. She got out. She moved. She found husband number 3, a man named Axel Johansson, and this one actually lasted 14 years, give or take, and it gave her the kind of middle-class respectability she'd been chasing since Redlands. It also gave her the last name she'd carry for a while before finally settling on Puente. Husband number 4 lasted less than a week, and through all of it, the arrests kept coming. Forged checks, running a brothel, and the one that mattered most, the one that first revealed the shape of what she was really doing, stealing money from elderly people she was supposed to be taking care of. This is where the pattern appears for the first time in the record. In the late 1970s, she was operating an unofficial boarding house in Sacramento, taking in elderly residents and collecting their social security and disability payments on their behalf, taking care of their finances, she called it, being helpful. And she was helpful. She really did manage their paperwork, really did keep the house running, really did provide a kind of functional order that these particular people, with their particular difficulties, couldn't manage on their own. She also forged their signatures on checks and kept the money. The courts caught up with her. She was charged with forging the names of 8 elderly residents on 34 checks, convicted and sentenced. She did time. She was released on probation with a specific condition attached. She was not allowed to work with elderly people. She walked out of that courtroom and started looking for new tenants the next day, because by then she already had the house. She already had the reputation. Years of it, carefully built. She already had a method that worked cleanly and quietly and left no obvious trail. And she had no intention of abandoning it because a judge had told her to. The probation officers came for their check-ins. They saw the house. They saw the elderly tenants. They drank the tea she poured them. They left with good reports every time. She couldn't stop, or she wouldn't. After all these years, nobody ever really sorted out which one it was. What is known is that in 1982, she was convicted of drugging 3 elderly patients and stealing their money and valuables. She got 5 years. She was released early. While she was inside, she wasn't wasting a minute. But before the letters, before Gilmuth, before what came next, it's worth pausing on what daily life in that house actually looked like. Because the horror of it isn't only in the yard, it's in the mornings. Every day, Puente got up early. She made breakfast. Real breakfast. Eggs, toast, sometimes oatmeal in winter, coffee that was always hot when the tenants came down. She set the table. She remembered who took their coffee with sugar and who didn't, who couldn't eat early and needed to wait. She asked about nights, about dreams, about whether the medication had helped or made things worse. She did their laundry. She helped them with their paperwork. Letters from the government, forms that needed filling out, documents that confused people who had spent years without needing to navigate bureaucracy. She walked some of them to their appointments. She called their social workers when something seemed wrong. She was, by every observable measure, an excellent caretaker. And the tenants, many of whom had spent years being managed by institutions or avoided by family or simply ignored by the city they lived in, responded to that care with something that looked like genuine affection. They called her by name. They told social workers she was wonderful. A few of them, like Alvaro, called her Mama. This is the part that investigators found most difficult to process. Not the yard, but the breakfast table. The fact that both things were true at the same time. That the woman who knelt down to pick up something a confused old man had dropped was the same woman who had calculated exactly how much flurazepam it would take to ensure he didn't wake up. That the warmth was real, and the method was real, and they occupied the same body, the same house, the same ordinary mornings. She was writing letters. One of the people she wrote to was a man named Everson Gilmuth, 77 years old, retired from a long working life in Oregon. Quiet, lonely, the kind of man who filled his days with small routines and had nobody left to share them with. He had a kind face and a silver watch he'd worn so long it had molded to the shape of his wrist. He wrote back to her first letter, then again. And then they were corresponding every week. And in his letters, between the careful handwriting and the polite questions about her health, she could hear the thing she was best at hearing before anyone else had even noticed it. Loneliness. Not the dramatic kind that announces itself. The quiet, structural kind. The kind built into a man's daily routine when that routine has nobody in it. When she was released early in '85, he was waiting at the prison gates in a red pickup truck, ready, in his careful, unhurried way, to build a life with the woman he'd been writing to for months. They came back to Sacramento together, opened a joint bank account. He signed over power of attorney on his finances as a demonstration of trust, she explained. The kind of practical arrangement that serious people made when they were building something together. He agreed. He trusted her. They made plans for a wedding. A few weeks later, he was gone. Puente kept writing letters to his family. In his name, in his handwriting, or close enough. Said he was sick and couldn't write himself. Then that he'd gone away for a while. His sister in Oregon kept every one of those letters, neatly folded in their original envelopes, tied together with a piece of ribbon. She would bring them to investigators years later, unable to explain the feeling she'd had reading them, that something in the phrasing was slightly off, that her brother had never quite written like that, but she hadn't been able to say exactly what was wrong. Meanwhile, Puente hired a carpenter named Ismael Flores to build her a box. About 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, deep enough to be useful. For books and old junk, she told him. His payment wasn't cash. It was the red pickup truck that had been sitting in her driveway since Everson Gilmouth arrived. Flores built the box, came back a few days later and found the lid already nailed shut. The box was heavy, much heavier than old books and junk would account for. Puente asked him to help haul it to a storage unit. On the way, she suggested they just dump it by the river instead. Easier, she said, less trouble. Flores didn't ask why. A few weeks later, a fisherman working the banks of the Sacramento River came across a wooden box caught in the reeds near the shore. Inside, wrapped in layer after layer of plastic sheeting, was the body of an elderly man. The silver watch was still on his wrist. It took 3 years to identify him because by then there wasn't much left to work with. His name was eventually confirmed through the watch, through dental records, through the letters his sister had saved. Everson Gilmouth, 77 years old, from Oregon. By then, Puente had already opened the new boarding house, had already been taking in tenants for years, had already buried several of them in the yard. And the system she'd spent years refining, it ran like clockwork. A new tenant would move in, usually sent by a social worker who needed somewhere to place a difficult case, someone who'd been turned away by other facilities and who needed a patient, experienced caretaker. Puente handled all the paperwork with practiced efficiency: Social Security enrollment, disability benefit claims, SSI applications. She knew those forms better than most of the social workers who referred people to her. She could navigate the system quickly, get everything set up cleanly, and have a check arriving within weeks. Then she'd suggest, gently at first, and then more firmly if needed, that she'd be managing the tenants' finances on their behalf, for their own good, so the money got used properly, so they never went without. The tenant received a small allowance, enough to buy cigarettes, maybe a coffee, something that felt like independence without actually being any. The rest went directly to Puente. At the same time, she managed their medications. Flurazepam, a powerful sedative, the kind that causes deep, heavy sleep and a fog that makes people compliant, slow to question things, easy to redirect. She obtained prescriptions from multiple doctors simultaneously, different physicians who didn't know about each other and who each believed they were her only prescriber. At the right dose, the drug made a person agreeable and quiet, unable to organize resistance or complaint. At a higher dose, the kind that would be very difficult to distinguish from natural causes in an elderly person with existing health problems, it ended things entirely. When a tenant died, she didn't call anyone. No ambulance, no social worker, no police report. She waited for the right moment, usually after dark, when the street was quiet, and then she called a laborer, always a different one, hired separately each time, paid in cash. Sometimes she used inmates on work release programs, men who needed cash and had learned not to ask questions. The task was always presented simply: there's some digging needed in the back of the yard. Heavy work, I'll pay you well. Come after dark. Some of the holes were covered with concrete afterward. Others, she planted flowers over. Marigolds, petunias, the kind of cheerful, ordinary planting that a proud homeowner does in the spring. After each burial, life in the house continued without interruption. She cashed the dead tenant's government check the following month, signing their name in her neat, unhurried handwriting. The check cleared. The next one came. Month after month, sometimes for years after a person had been buried in the yard, their name continued to appear on government ledgers as a living recipient of benefits. Neighbors sometimes noticed a smell from the direction of the yard. Puente had an explanation ready. Sewer problems. She'd already called the city. These things took time. A real nuisance, but what can you do? People nodded and went back inside. With the accumulated income from the dead, and from the living tenants whose money she also took just less permanently, She bought herself the life she'd spent 40 years trying to acquire. Good tailors, plastic surgery. Investigators would later find the receipts, a facelift, cosmetic procedures that cost more than most of her tenants saw in a year. Nice restaurants where she was known by name. Mail-order catalogs full of things she didn't need and ordered anyway, because being the kind of woman who could afford to order things from catalogs was the point. She was finally, after Redlands, after the orphanage, after 4 failed marriages and 2 prison stints, and a childhood that had given her absolutely nothing, a respected woman in a good home on a decent street in a real city. The neighbors thought, well, business must be going well for dear Mrs. Puente. Investigators would later calculate that in just the final 2 years of the boarding house's operation, she collected close to $87,000 from dead tenants, roughly $5,000 a month, from people who were already in the ground. And here's the thing that investigators kept coming back to years later. She almost got caught, several times, in ways that should have been enough. In 1982, before most of the killings at the boarding house even started, a woman who had been living with Puente died of a drug overdose. Her name was Ruth Monroe. The family went straight to the police, not as people who suspected something vaguely wrong, but as people who had specific concerns about a specific woman with a specific history. They said, "This is not a suicide. We know this woman. We know her history of preying on elderly people. Look at what she's done before. This needs to be investigated." The detective who took the meeting listened carefully. He thanked them for coming in. He closed the file. A few years later, a former tenant filed a formal complaint with authorities saying that Puente had been administering drugs to her without consent and taking her government checks. She gave names. She gave dates. She gave details that would have required verification, not dismissal. Police took her statement. Nothing happened. And in the summer of '88, just a few months before everything finally, irreversibly fell apart, a woman named Brenda Trujillo wrote a letter to the Sacramento Police Department. Brenda had done time with Puente. She had lived at the boarding house briefly after her release, and she had written the letter because she believed, based on what she had seen and heard, that people were dying in that house and being buried in the yard. The letter was specific. It named the address. It described the drugs. It described the checks. It described the yard. The letter was received, logged, and filed. No investigation followed. The explanation police gave later, when journalists pressed them on it, was that Brenda had a history of heroin addiction and that a tip from someone with that kind of background wasn't considered reliable enough to justify the resources an investigation would require. There were already several bodies under those flower beds when that explanation was given. There were 9 of them. Every one of them had a life before they ever crossed paths with her. Ruth Monroe wasn't just a tenant. She was Puente's friend. A real friend, someone she'd known for years, called on the phone, went out to lunch with in better times. When Ruth's husband got seriously ill, she moved in with Dorothea because she trusted her, because she figured, it'll be easier with a friend close by, someone who knows me, someone who'll be there. She lived in that house for a few weeks. She died of a drug overdose, a combination of codeine and acetaminophen, in quantities that would have been difficult for a woman in her condition to have taken accidentally. The coroner wrote, "Suicide." Ruth's sons went to the police and said it plainly and without hedging, but "We know this woman, we know our mother, this was not a suicide. Look at her record. Look at the house she was living in. This was murder." The police listened politely and sent them home. Alvaro Montoya was the kind of man the world never quite took seriously. 50s, schizophrenia, intellectually disabled. He heard voices, would argue with them in Spanish right there on the sidewalk, waving his arms, laughing at something nobody else could see. His world was complicated and private and mostly incomprehensible to the people around him, and he knew that. And he'd learned to navigate it with a kind of lopsided dignity. At Puente's house, he found something that felt like stability. A room that was his. Breakfast every morning, someone who remembered his name and seemed glad to see him. He called her Mama, not as a joke, not with irony, genuinely, because that was what she felt like to him. The closest thing to that word he'd found in a long time. A few weeks before he disappeared, he told a caseworker at his local rehabilitation center, "She gives me medicine I don't want to take. It makes me feel wrong. I want to leave, but I can't get up." The caseworker made a note of it. The note didn't go anywhere. His body was found under a freshly planted apricot tree in the side yard. The tree had only been in the ground for a few weeks. Betty Palmer, 78 years old, white short-sleeved nightgown, found at the feet of a garden statue, St. Francis of Assisi, patron of the poor and the forgotten, just a few feet from the sidewalk. Her head, her hands, and her feet were missing. Investigators never gave an official explanation for that detail. Some aspects of Betty Palmer's case remain sealed to this day. The full truth of what happened to her is something the record does not contain. Benjamin Fink once whispered to his roommate, in a moment of unusual clarity, "I need to get out of here. She gives me something, and I sleep all the time, and I can't think straight anymore." He said it like a man reporting a weather condition. Matter of fact, resigned. Not long after, Puente told another tenant she was going to take Ben upstairs and make him feel better. After that, nobody in the house saw Ben again. His body was found wrapped in plastic sheeting, sealed with layers of tape. Very neat, very deliberate. Vera Faye Martin, 64 years old. According to the forensic examination, and this is the detail that stays with people, the one that's hardest to put down, she may have still been alive when she was buried. The medical examiners could not rule it out. They could not confirm it either. That question has no answer now. It never will. Stop here for a moment. Not on the numbers, not on the method, on the people. Alvaro, who called his killer Mama. Ruth, who moved in because she trusted her friend. Betty, in a white nightgown at the feet of the patron saint of the forgotten. Vera, whose last experience on this earth may have been waking up in the dark. Puente didn't choose them by accident. She chose the ones the system had already stopped counting, the ones investigators would later call shadow people. People who live on the margins, disappear quietly, and whose absence doesn't trigger alarms. It just reduces the caseload. That was her real talent. Not cooking breakfast, not smiling the right way, knowing who wouldn't be looked for, and the system, the same system that was supposed to protect these people, handed them to her. Because this isn't just the story of one woman. It's the story of a system that looked directly at her and saw nothing. Back in the late 70s, a court had already prohibited her from working with elderly people. Parole officers came to the house for regular check-ins. They saw the elderly tenants. They saw the stacks of checks on the table. They drank the tea she poured for them. They left with good reports. In '82, Ruth Monroe's sons went to the police and said, "This is murder. Look at this woman. Look at her record." Nobody listened. In the summer of '88, just months before everything came apart, a woman named Brenda Trujillo wrote a letter to the police. She'd done time with Puente, lived at the boarding house briefly after getting out. The letter was detailed and specific. Puente was drugging tenants, forging checks, burying people in the yard. The letter was received, filed. The explanation police gave later, when journalists asked why nothing had been done with it, was that Brenda had a history of heroin addiction and that her claims therefore weren't considered credible enough to justify an investigation. There were already several bodies under those flower beds. This is worth sitting with for a moment. because it's the part of this story that tends to get glossed over in favor of the more dramatic elements. The yard, the bodies, the escape to Los Angeles. But this is arguably the most important part. Why did the system miss it? Over and over and over again. Part of the answer is simple and uncomfortable. Puente looked right. In America in the 80s, the image of a kind, elderly woman with a generous heart and a spotless home was nearly bulletproof. There is a category of person that we do not suspect, that our instincts tell us cannot be what the evidence suggests. Puente inhabited that category perfectly, and she knew it, and she had spent decades cultivating it. Looking right was not incidental to what she did. It was the method. But the bigger reason, the one that goes beyond any individual failure, was about her victims. The mentally ill, the chronic alcoholics, the elderly men with no documents and no family. The people the system euphemistically called difficult cases. When one of these people disappeared from a social worker's caseload, the response was not alarm. The response was, in many cases, something closer to relief. One fewer file, one fewer check-in, one fewer person whose life was genuinely very hard to manage and who would probably end up back in a crisis situation anyway. Nobody was looking for them because nobody had been truly looking for them in a long time. Puente understood this before the social workers did. She understood it before the police did. She had watched the system from the inside as a person who had been processed through it in various ways since childhood, and she had seen exactly which people it tracked carefully and which people it lost without distress. She built her operation in the space the system had vacated. She used the fact that nobody cared what happened to people like her tenants. And indifference, it turned out, was more reliable than any accomplice, more reliable than the best cover story, more reliable than anything she could have engineered herself. The system had engineered it for her. In the fall of '88, a social worker named Judy Moyes started getting worried. Alvaro Montoya, her client, the one she had placed at the boarding house a few months earlier, had gone dark, missed his scheduled check-in, wasn't picking up the phone, hadn't shown up at any of the regular locations where she expected to find him during the week. She called the house. Puente answered. The explanation was calm and easy, delivered in the slightly patient tone of someone who has answered this kind of question before. Alvaro had gone down to Mexico to visit family. Everything was fine. He'd said his goodbyes, packed a bag, and left. Nothing to worry about. Judy Moyes hung up the phone and sat with that for a moment. She had been Alvaro's caseworker for years. She knew his rhythms, his habits, his relationship with the voices he heard and the people around him. She knew his family situation, which was not warm, which had never been warm, which was the kind of relationship that made an independent trip to Mexico about as plausible as a solo trek to Antarctica. She filed a missing persons report. Detective John Cabrera showed up at the house on a grey November morning. The sky was flat and low, the kind of November sky that presses down on the Central Valley and makes everything feel muted and slightly underwater. The air smelled like wet pavement and the first genuine cold of the season. The Christmas lights on the iron fence were lit even in the middle of the day, casting small dots of colored light on the sidewalk. Just to talk, just to follow up. Puente met him at the door with a smile that had been practiced until it looked effortless. She walked him through the rooms, china dolls on the shelves, lace doilies on every surface, the smell of lavender, a teapot already warming on the stove. She repeated the story about Mexico, answered his questions calmly, offered tea. The tenants sat in the corners of rooms and found things to look at that weren't Cabrera. He was almost ready to wrap it up and leave. One of the tenants, a man who had been sitting in the corner of the common room looking at the floor, waited until Puente left the room. Then he stood up, walked quietly across the room to the other officer, and pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. The officer opened it. 4 words, in handwriting that had been compressed into as small a space as possible, like someone writing a note they didn't want found. She wants me to lie. Later, once Puente was occupied elsewhere, that tenant told them more. In the past few months, another resident had disappeared, just stopped being there one day, no explanation given. And something else. Puente had been hiring men to come work in the backyard after dark, digging. Some of the holes had been filled in with concrete afterward. Cabrera went out to the yard. In the far corner, near the back fence, the ground was not right. Small mounds of earth, too deliberate to be accidental, too fresh to be anything that had settled naturally. A cluster of flower bushes shoved into the soil at what appeared to be recent intervals, still slightly too upright, the roots not yet established. It looked like someone had done some planting quickly and in a hurry, and wanted it to look like it had been there longer than it had. He went back to his car for a shovel. November ground in Sacramento is heavy clay. It resists. It smells like the cold version of itself, mineral and dense. And there was something else in the smell as he began to dig, something that an experienced detective learns to recognize, and that once you have recognized it once, you never mistake for anything else again. One of the officers digging alongside him would describe it in an interview years later. We were finding pieces of cloth, little bits of things, pieces that looked like dried-out leather. We just kept going, and then I looked up. He stopped for a moment in the interview, and there was Dorothea, standing in a second-floor window, looking straight down at us. She wasn't moving. She was just watching. 20 minutes in, the shovel hit something solid. Fabric. A bedsheet that had once been white. Cabrera pulled it carefully. A human leg came out of the ground. That was the first body. Leona Carpenter, 78 years old, buried close to the back fence. Puente was still in the house. Cabrera went back inside. She was standing in the kitchen, calm as ever. She said all of this was very upsetting to her. She needed a few minutes away, a cup of coffee to settle her nerves. Her nephew was staying at a hotel nearby. She just wanted to see a familiar face. She'd be right back. Cabrera looked at her. She was not under arrest. Officially, still just a witness. He nodded and personally walked her out, through the crowd of reporters and onlookers packed around the fence, all the way to the gate. He watched her head toward the hotel. Then he turned around and went back to the yard. A few minutes later, a second body, much more recent than the first, wrapped in several layers of blankets and plastic bags. Now they had grounds to arrest her. Cabrera dropped the shovel and ran to the hotel. She was gone. I had such a sick feeling, he would say later, like someone had reached in and pulled out everything inside me. While he was standing over that second grave, calling for backup, realizing what he'd done, she was already in a cab heading west across the city. She stopped somewhere for a drink, vodka and orange juice to settle her nerves. Then another cab, then a bus terminal. By nightfall, she was on a Greyhound heading south, watching the Central Valley slide past in the dark. 5 days. 5 days she was in the wind while her backyard gave up body after body. 5, 6, 7. Camera crews camped at the fence around the clock. Reporters broadcast live from the sidewalk outside the yellow Victorian. The names of the dead ran across the bottom of the TV screen in a slow ticker, one after another, as identification came in. Sacramento's police chief answered questions at a podium that he clearly wished he weren't standing at. They had let their prime suspect walk out the front door. A 60-year-old woman in a house dress, under their noses, because she said she needed coffee. Dorothea Puente spent the first 3 days barely leaving her motel room in Los Angeles. She watched the news coverage of her own backyard. She ate from vending machines. She thought about her next move. On the fourth day, she went out. She found a bar a few blocks from the motel, the kind of place with afternoon regulars and a TV in the corner and nobody asking too many questions. She ordered a drink, settled onto a stool, and looked around the room with the practiced ease of a woman who has spent 60 years reading rooms and deciding what to do in them. There was an older man sitting by himself at the end of the bar, retired, named Charles Wilgers. Alone in the middle of the afternoon on a weekday, which meant either he had nowhere to be or he didn't want to be there. Either way, she knew what that looked like. She moved closer, introduced herself as Donna, asked him what he did for a living. They talked for a few hours. She was warm and funny and genuinely attentive, asking follow-up questions, remembering what he'd said 5 minutes ago, making him feel like the most interesting man in the room, which to her, in that moment, he was. He was company. He was normalcy. He was a man who didn't know who she was, and that was exactly what she needed. She was, in those hours, exactly the woman she had always wanted to be. The next morning, Wilgers turned on the television and saw her face fill the screen. He called the police immediately. Within hours, officers walked back into that same bar. She was sitting right there, straight-backed, calm, like she'd never planned on going anywhere at all. At the station, she said the words she would repeat for the next 20 years, in court, in prison, in every interview she gave, right up to the last thing she said publicly before she died. "I never killed anyone. My conscience is clear." Not a muscle moved in her face. What investigators found in the house and yard took weeks to process fully and filled thousands of pages of reports. 7 bodies in the garden, each one wrapped, bed sheets, plastic wrap, duct tape. Some buried under concrete slabs poured after the burial, the concrete still relatively new when investigators broke through it. Each in a separate hole, neat, methodical. Deliberate in the way that something is deliberate when the person doing it has done it before. Several bodies were wrapped in bedding that matched the linens still on the beds inside the house. Same patterns, same faded fabric. She had stripped the sheets from the beds and used them. The 8th body, that wooden box by the river, Everson Gilmuth. The silver watch still on his wrist. It was that watch that finally gave investigators something to work with when identifying him. The 9th victim was Alvaro Montoya, the one whose disappearance had sent Judy Moyes to a phone and then to a police report and then to a detective with a shovel. He was under the apricot tree, the tree she had planted over him, the tree that had been in the ground only a few weeks when Cabrera first walked through that yard. Toxicology came back the same across every case, flurazepam. At concentrations that the victims, given their ages and medical histories and body weights, could not have accumulated on their own. Someone had been giving it to them, regularly, at calibrated doses. A document examiner analyzed 60 government checks recovered from the property and bank records. All of them bore the signatures of dead tenants. All of them had been signed by the same hand, same pen pressure, same letter formations, same small habitual loops. The social worker who had placed Alvaro Montoya in her care, the one who had called her care the best he had ever seen, took the witness stand and gave his testimony in the careful, contained way of a man trying to be precise while also trying to process something he still genuinely could not reconcile. He had believed in her. The court listened. The archives of the Sacramento History Center still hold the complete case files, excavation photographs, physical evidence logs, prescription records from each of the 3 physicians writing her flurazepam scripts, hand-drawn diagrams of the yard with the burial sites numbered. An archivist who spent 6 months processing the collection wrote afterward, "Murder, mental illness, elder abuse, all of it presented clinically and coldly like an inventory. That, honestly, was the most disturbing part of all. Detective Cabrera would say years later, quietly, the way a man speaks when something has never quite left him. We still don't know who helped her move the bodies. She clearly didn't do it alone. Someone knew and stayed quiet and is living with that right now. The trial opened in early '93. For the sake of fairness, the case was moved out of Sacramento. The whole city had already made up its mind. The venue was Monterey, a few hours down the coast. The courtroom was full every day. Puente walked in wearing an elegant dark suit, hair done, nails done, horn-rimmed glasses in place. She moved to her seat with the unhurried manner of a woman who had somewhere to be and was not particularly rushed about getting there. She looked exactly like a distinguished older woman who'd been mixed up with someone else through some unfortunate error, and who was prepared to wait patiently with dignity until it was sorted out. 153 witnesses, more than 3,500 pieces of physical evidence, thousands of pages of testimony, one of the largest and most complex trials in California history. The defense argued steadily, everyone died of natural causes: alcoholism, pre-existing illness, their own medications. Puente was afraid to report the deaths because of her prior record, afraid that any contact with authorities would send her back to prison. She was not a killer. She was a frightened woman who had handled a crisis catastrophically, but not criminally. The prosecution answered with the toxicology reports, the forged checks, the pattern of hiring different laborers each time in cash, so no single person could see the whole picture, and one simple, unanswerable question: if this was all fear and accident and panic, why did she run while they were still digging up the first body? Innocent people don't do that. The jury deliberated for 24 days. Verdict: guilty on 3 of 9 counts, deadlocked on the remaining 6, including Alvaro Montoya, including Ruth Monroe. No death penalty. 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Puente heard the verdict with the same expression she'd worn when she first opened her door for Detective Cabrera. Calm, patient. The expression of a woman who decided long ago on a version of events and has no intention of leaving it. She turned to her attorney and said something quietly. Nobody heard what it was. Dorothea Puente spent the last 18 years of her life at a women's correctional facility in Central California. She was a model inmate. She went to the prison chapel every Sunday, read John Grisham novels, watched television in the common area, participated in whatever programs were offered. The staff described her as polite, cooperative, no trouble to anyone. Elderly inmates often have this quality, the violence of whatever they did existing so far outside the controlled routine of institutional life that the person in front of you seems entirely disconnected from the file in the cabinet. In the late 90s, she began corresponding with a young man named Shane Bugbee, a publisher with an interest in the unusual corners of American culture. He came for visits, brought recording equipment, sat across the table from her with the plexiglass between them, and talked to her about her life. She sent him pages torn from a notepad in her cell, neat handwriting, occasional small illustrations in the margins, recipes written out in the careful way of someone who learned to cook before they had many ingredients to work with. In 2004, the book came out, Cooking with a Serial Killer, Pumpkin Pie, Christmas Cookies, Tomato Basil Soup, a cheesecake she called the family recipe. The family, presumably, being the 18 brothers and sisters who had never existed. The recipes were completely ordinary, the kind of thing a sweet grandmother makes for the holidays, the kind of food that shows up on church potluck tables and in the back seats of cars on the way to Thanksgiving. On the cover, her photograph in prison clothes. That same smile, those same glasses, the same expression of a woman who has absolutely nothing to hide and cannot understand why everyone keeps acting like she does. Journalists who visited her in those years described the same experience. She was happy to talk. About recipes. About her childhood in the warm, large Mexican family that had never existed. About how the justice system had failed to understand her, had failed to see the full picture, had been unfair in ways she could list at length. When the conversation turned toward the yard, toward the bodies, toward the fluorazepam, or the forged checks, or the 5 days in Los Angeles, she would smile in the particular way she had and change the subject. Once, a journalist asked her directly, "Do you ever feel sorry for them?" She paused, just long enough to seem like she was giving it genuine consideration. "Sometimes I think maybe the death penalty would have been better. At least that's quick. This way, I'm here until I die. It's the same thing." Not a word about the people buried in her yard. Not a word about Alvaro, who called her Mama. Not a word about Ruth, who moved in because she trusted her friend. In an interview for a Sacramento magazine a couple of years before her death, she said, "They don't have all the facts. No one has ever really talked to me. God always puts obstacles in people's way. Look at Job. Look at Moses. Things happen for a reason." She died in the spring of 2011, 82 years old. Natural causes, which is the category her death fell into, as opposed to the category most of her tenants' deaths had been made to fall into. The last thing she said publicly, a few months before the end, through the prison glass, to a journalist who had driven down for one more visit. "I never killed anyone." Same delivery as always. Same composed expression. Not a muscle moved. The house on F Street is still standing. It's changed hands several times. One of the later owners ran tours. You could pay a small admission, walk through the rooms, stand in the yard where they dug. The proceeds went to help Sacramento's homeless population. The very kind of people the woman who owned that house had once preyed upon. Someone put a sign on the front of the building. Written in the voice of the house itself, "A terrible, terrible woman did this. Don't blame me." The house. Detective Cabrera gave interviews for years after the verdict. A tired man with a quiet voice who'd seen a lot. Someone asked him, "What still stays with you after all this time?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We never found out who helped her move the bodies. Somebody knew, stayed quiet, and is out there living with it right now." Alvaro Montoya called her Mama. Ruth Monroe moved in because she trusted her friend. Betty Palmer was found at the feet of the patron saint of the forgotten, Vera Faye Martin. She may still have been alive. The house on F Street is still standing. It's changed hands several times over the years. One of the later owners ran tours. You could pay a small admission, walk through the rooms, stand in the yard where the digging had happened. People drove from hours away for this. They stood at the edge of the flower beds and looked at the ordinary California soil and tried to understand how something like this had been possible right here, in plain sight, in a city with functioning social services and law enforcement and neighbors who noticed things. The proceeds from the tours went to help Sacramento's homeless population, the very kind of people the woman who owned that house had once preyed upon. Someone, at some point, put a sign on the front of the building. Written in the voice of the house itself, "A terrible, terrible woman did this. Don't blame me." The house. Detective Cabrera gave interviews for years after the verdict. A tired man with a quiet voice who'd seen a lot of things over a long career and had found a way to carry most of them. Someone asked him, "What still stays with you after all this time?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We never found out who helped her move the bodies. Somebody knew, stayed quiet, and is out there living with it right now." Alvaro Montoya called her Mama. Ruth Monroe moved in because she trusted her friend. Betty Palmer was found at the feet of the patron saint of the forgotten, Vera Faye Martin. She may still have been alive. That's what stays with you about this story. Not the scale of it, not the details, the simplicity of it. She wasn't a genius. She wasn't running some elaborate long con that required extraordinary intelligence to execute. She wasn't untouchable, protected by powerful connections or a particularly clever set of arrangements. She was a heavy-set older woman in a house dress with a plate of hot food and a smile that she had spent 60 years perfecting. And that was enough. It was more than enough. It worked for years in plain sight in the middle of a functioning American city. Because we don't look for monsters where we see care. It's one of the things that makes us human, the instinct to extend trust toward the image of nurturing. She weaponized that instinct completely and without apparent hesitation. Because we stop keeping track of people who fall through the cracks. We tell ourselves they've moved on, found a new situation, made choices we don't need to account for. The system closes the file and moves to the next case, and nobody looks back. Because the system closes files with relief instead of alarm. Dorothea Puente didn't kill in spite of the system. She killed because the system made it possible. Because the system had, over decades, built a set of blind spots precisely the size and shape of her victims. And she understood those blind spots better than anyone. And she put them to use with the patience of someone who had been studying the gap since childhood. And the question that's left over when this is all done, it's not really about her, it's about us. About what kind of society builds institutions capable of losing people and then feeling relieved rather than disturbed about losing them. About who we decide counts enough to track, to worry about, to notice when they go quiet. How many houses like hers exist right now? How many shadow people disappear every year, quietly, without headlines, without anyone making a fuss? How many files get closed with a breath of relief rather than a cold knot of concern? We don't know, because nobody's counting. And the woman who knew that better than anyone, who built her entire operation on that knowledge, who exploited it for years, who died in prison still insisting her conscience was clear, she understood something about us that most of us still haven't fully reckoned with. She understood what we were willing to forget.